Hi, Mr. Loomis. We're going to finish Unit 18, which is all about times when Americans failed. Today, we'll be looking at Lesson 3, which is about the economy of the 1970s and the process of globalization that is still going on today. This is a story that reminds us that sometimes things in life can be both good and bad, and we have to learn to balance those two outcomes. Let's begin by just previewing our topics. We'll start by talking about how the world's economy worked after World War II, and then something called the Nixon shock. We'll talk about an oil embargo and how it affected drivers and car makers in America. We'll discuss a really bad situation called stagflation. And finally, we'll get into the details of globalization, which is a word you might have heard before. Let's get started. In 1944, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, leaders from 44 countries met to make a new plan for how money would be exchanged around the world. The new plan was called the Bretton Woods System. The leaders at the meeting hoped to find a way to avoid depressions and help all countries grow their economies. In the Bretton Woods System, countries agreed to use American dollars when they had to pay debts to another country. For example, France used American dollars to pay its debts to West Germany instead of using French francs or German marks. Everyone agreed that the dollar would always be worth 35 ounces of gold. This is called the gold standard, and it meant that the United States promised to have 35 ounces of gold for every dollar they printed. Other countries set the value of their money by comparing them to American dollars. In the first years after World War II, the Bretton Woods system worked well. Countries in Western Europe and other capitalist countries did well. With the Marshall Plan, Japan and Europe rebuilt from the war, and countries outside the United States wanted dollars to spend on things made in America. Because the United States owned over half of the world's official gold, the system seemed like it would work well for many years. But there was a problem. From 1950 to 1969, Germany and Japan recovered from the war and rebuilt their factories. America wasn't the only strong nation anymore. Other countries started making more of the world's things. Also, Americans began spending more money on things made in other places than they earned selling things made in America. Money started moving out of the United States. By the end of the 1960s, other countries stopped liking the Bretton Woods system. A big problem was that the American government could print money easily, but other nations had to pay to get American dollars. By 1966, the United States did not have enough gold on hand to back up all the other dollars other countries were using. In May 1971, West German leaders decided that the Bretton Woods system was hurting more than it was helping. Leaders in West Germany decided that their money was not going to be matched to the dollar. In the next 3 months, the West German economy improved. At the same time, the dollar fell 7.5% against the Deutschmark. Other countries asked the American government to give them gold in exchange for their dollars. Switzerland traded in $50 million for gold. France got $191 million in gold. Under the Bretton Woods system, the American dollar was always worth 35 ounces of gold. As the European countries left the system, the dollar lost its value. To fix the problem, President Nixon decided to end the Bretton Woods system by giving up the gold standard. Americans would stop exchanging dollars for gold. This stopped the run on American gold. Today, our money has value because we believe it does. There's no gold to back up dollars. Above all, the Federal Reserve can print as much money as it wants. This is useful when there's a problem in the economy because the Fed can help banks get the money they need to make it through hard times. The Nixon shock, as this change is now called, solved the problem in the 1970s, but had some negative effects also. For example, with no gold to back up our dollars, no one can ever really be sure how much money or how much our money is worth. This can make it hard for traders and investors to make good decisions. But the biggest change that happened right away after the Nixon shock was stagflation. Americans were used to the economy being good, it had been ever since World War II. But in the 1970s, for the first time since the Great Depression, Americans worried that their children might not be able to have as much as their parents. The problem was a bad mix of three things. Inflation. Inflation is the slow rise in prices over time. Some inflation is normally good for an economy. For example, if things cost about 1% to 3% more each year, things are good. But then in the 1970s, inflation was more than 10%. At the same time, the second problem, unemployment, was reaching a rate of nearly 10%. That meant that more than 10% of all people who wanted work couldn't find a job. Not since the Great Depression of the 1930s had so many Americans been looking for work. Factories also stopped making as much. And this is called stagflation, a mix of high inflation, high unemployment, and low economic growth. Americans began to worry about their economy. They began to ask themselves what had gone wrong. Richard Nixon tried to fight inflation, first by cutting government spending, but in the end, by trying to set rules for prices and how much people could earn at their jobs. President Ford watched inflation go over 11% in 1974, so he started a program, government propaganda, called Whip Inflation Now, or WIN, WIN. In WIN, Ford asked Americans to not spend as much, to not ask for more money at work, and to not raise the prices of things they were selling. But after the Watergate scandal, many Americans didn't like Ford. When he ran against Jimmy Carter in 1976, he lost. Many people liked President Carter at first. He went to church, he was a peanut farmer, and had been the governor of Georgia. Unlike Nixon, people thought Carter was an honest, tell-it-like-it-is person. Carter cut taxes and cut government spending, but the inflation rate went up to 18% in 1980. At the same time, the unemployment rate was at about 7%. Before the 1970s, the most popular cars in America were big, heavy, powerful. In 1971, one common car in America only got 15 miles per gallon on the highway. Detroit's big three, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, had sold most of the cars in America. Without anyone else making cars, they'd stopped being creative or making bigger, heavier cars that wasted gas. Even worse, in the 1970s, Americans fell in love with big, powerful muscle cars that wasted the most gas of all. They might have been fun to drive, but they were about to ruin the economy. When Israel won the Yom Kippur War in 1973 against its Arab neighbors, Arab countries that produced oil took revenge against Israel's allies. They led the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, and started an embargo. They decided to limit the amount of oil they sold to the United States. Suddenly, America couldn't get enough oil. Oil and things made from oil suddenly became very expensive, and sometimes there wasn't even oil to buy. Cars and drivers sat in long lines at gas stations, and everyone paid more as the price of gasoline quadrupled. With high prices, the much smaller and more efficient Japanese and European cars that use smaller engines and front-wheel drive became very popular with shoppers. American car companies tried to adjust, but the cars they made were still less efficient and less well-built than the imports. The Detroit automakers simply could not change fast enough. Some of the worst American cars of the 1970s, such as the Chevrolet Nova and Ford Pinto, are remembered as examples of what can go wrong when people think they know everything and stop thinking critically. It took General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford over 10 years to fix their problems. By that time, Japanese and European cars became common on American roads. The government tried to help solve the problems caused by the embargo. A national speed limit of 55 miles per hour was created to try to get people to use less gas. In 1977, the Department of Energy was started. The government created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Today, the reserve holds about 700 million barrels of oil in tanks in Louisiana and Texas, which is about as much oil as the United States uses in a month. But with demand high and supply low, gas stations were hurting. In the last week of February 1974, 20% of American gas stations had no gasoline to sell. Thousands of local gasoline stations went out of business and closed during the embargo. Some state governments started rationing gasoline. Cars with license plate numbers that ended in an odd number could only buy gas on odd-numbered days of the month, while others could buy only on even-numbered days. Americans loved their cars. American cities had been built with cars in mind. Americans drove from the suburbs to shopping malls and into downtowns to work. They took long vacations in their cars. Cars were to the modern American what horses had been to the cowboys. Americans hated rationing. There were even cases of violence when truck drivers went on strike to protest the rationing rules and fought with truck drivers who didn't go on strike. Just like President Ford, President Carter struggled to help the auto industry, but it wasn't cars that were Carter's downfall. It was a speech. In 1979, Carter met with dozens of important leaders to try to find a solution to the country's trouble. One advisor told him that the American people were just not confident like they used to be. He thought the problem was because of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. When Carter came back from his meetings at the White House on July 15, 1979, he went on television and told the American people, "I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation." This came to be known as his malaise speech. Malaise is a feeling of being tired, like a person feels when they're about to get sick. Carter never used the word malaise in the speech, but people still use it as the title of his speech because of what he said about America. Carter told people that Americans were losing their spirit and optimism because they were spending too much. This had led to the energy crisis. At first, people liked the speech, but then things started to turn around. Some thought that Carter was blaming the American people for having lost a can-do attitude. Carter's critics said that the president was in a malaise. If he were really a strong leader, they said, he would fix the energy crisis instead of blaming the problem on the people. 3 days after the speech, Carter asked all his top advisors to say they would quit, and 5 did. Americans didn't like the malaise speech or that Carter fired his advisors. Some Americans, it looked like Carter didn't have a plan to fix the economy. In the election of 1980, former Hollywood actor and California Governor Ronald Reagan easily beat Carter. Americans liked his positive message. One of his campaign ads said that it was morning again in America. After years of scandal and economic problems, Americans were ready for a new start. Since the time before America was a country, people bought things from other countries and sold things to other countries. But mostly, people bought and sold things to their neighbors. They ate food grown in nearby farms. Americans drove cars made in Detroit. They flew in planes made in Seattle. They toasted their bread, mowed their lawns, washed their clothes, and cooked their food with appliances made in America. All that changed at the end of the 1900s in a process called globalization. Beginning in the 1970s, American factory owners found it harder and harder to sell things because it costs less to pay workers in other countries. Those foreign factory owners could then sell things for less because it costs them less to pay their workers. Sometimes American business leaders had a hard time because of years of bad choices, as was the case of the Detroit automakers, who were not making cars that people wanted to buy. In other cases, other things like the Nixon shock changed the value of American money in the world and gave foreign companies an advantage. Without the Bretton Woods system keeping the value of the dollar high, Japanese electronic companies could sell televisions in the United States and make more money than before. Sony, Panasonic, Sharp, Pioneer, Casio, and Yamaha became common names in American stores. As the years went on, more and more products that had once been made in the United States were being made in other countries. In the case of the auto industry, people started to buy cars from Japan or Europe instead of American cars. In other cases, American companies closed their factories in America and opened new ones in countries where they didn't have to pay the workers as much. This is called outsourcing. During the 1970s and 1980s, 95% of the factories making clothing in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia shut down. This was very bad for these states. In some towns, everyone worked in a textile mill, knew someone who did, or worked in a business that sold things to these workers. All over America, working class people were being replaced by workers in other countries who would do the same job for less money. Nowhere was this easier to see than in the industrial heartland of the Midwest. In the 1800s, the cities of the Midwest grew, and immigrant workers moved in to find work in the Industrial Revolution's new factories. Carnegie's steel mills, and Henry Ford's auto factories, Rockefeller's oil refineries, and Pullman's railroad car company were examples of the creativity that was making America great. The industrial heartland of the United States was at its greatest during World War II, when its factories became the arsenal of democracy and built the tanks, planes, and trucks that won the war. As factories started to close in the 1970s and 1980s, the great cities of the Midwest started to fail. When the factories closed, the workers lost their jobs. People moved away to look for work. Business owners lost money when their customers had less to spend or stopped coming to shop after moving away. City governments could not provide basic services like picking up the trash or fixing the streets because there weren't enough people paying taxes. Schools closed. In some places, everyone in an entire neighborhood moved away. Crime and drug abuse went up. Middle-class families who could moved into better suburbs, leaving inner cities empty. In many cities, only the poor African-American families were left. Maps of cities like Detroit or Cleveland show rings of mostly white suburbs around nearly 100% African-American inner cities. Laws, government policies, and racist business practices made sure that neighborhoods stayed mostly all white or all African-American. A new term was created to describe the area of the country full of old, empty factories, the Rust Belt. What had once been something Americans were proud of, the region that had helped the country grow, became a symbol of its failure. Empty factories, boarded up storefronts, and graffiti-covered houses still can be seen in many of these cities. They remind us of how much outsourcing hurt American cities in the Midwest. From 1970 to 2006, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh lost about 45% of their people. After World War II, leaders tried to find ways to make the world more connected and peaceful. The Bretton Woods system, the United Nations, are two of the ideas they came up with. They also started the World Trade Organization, WTO, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank. The WTO is a place where world leaders can work on trade agreements. The goal of the WTO was to find ways to get rid of problems that stop trade between countries. The IMF is a super bank for the governments of the developing world. They can use the IMF instead of private banks, which might fail. The World Bank uses money from rich countries to pay for projects in the third world, like airports, irrigation systems, or programs to fight hunger and disease. Like most countries, the United States has made many free trade treaties. These treaties end tariffs and other rules that stop trade or make trade more expensive. Most famous of these is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. NAFTA is a treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It was created in 1994. These three countries agree to get rid of all tariffs on their products. For example, Canada will not charge a tariff or tax on meat brought across the border from American farms and sold to Canadians. The leaders of the world's richest countries meet every few years to talk about economic problems. These meetings of the leaders of the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan are known as the G7, short for Group of Seven. For a while, it was the G8 while Russia was invited. Interestingly, China's leaders are not invited, even though China is the world's second largest economy. Some people think globalization is bad, and meetings of the IMF, WTO, G7, and NAFTA are their favorite places to protest. Sometimes called the anti-globalization movement, these people have different reasons for disliking globalization. Some think that the large multinational companies are bad because they're only trying to make money and don't care about their workers or protecting the environment. They can see how third world workers earn much less than American workers and have to work long hours in dangerous factories. For the protesters, this is proof that large companies are bad for the world. Other people think that globalization is hurting democracy. They think that more and more of the most important decisions about the world are made by business leaders and the leaders of multinational organizations like the WTO. Protesters point out that no one voted for these leaders, even though they might have more power than presidents. In 2010, the Supreme Court said in a case, Citizens United versus FCC, that companies have an equal right to free speech under the First Amendment. This means that company leaders can spend as much as they want on political advertising. Companies cannot vote, but their leaders can use money to change voters' minds in ways that regular people cannot. Some of the people who worried about this loss of political control voted for Donald Trump in 2016 with his promises of America first and drain the swamp. The Occupy Wall Street movement that started in New York City in 2011 is an example of people who were upset about big banks and the power they thought banks had over the lives of regular people. Another problem with globalization is that local cultures are starting to disappear. If Italians start drinking Starbucks instead of shopping at local cafes, local Italian culture is hurt. If people in the mountains of Bolivia start to wear American jeans and t-shirts, local culture begins to fade. When Mongolian teenagers watch Hollywood movies and listen to American pop music, they are giving up their own culture and replacing it with American culture. Many people think globalization is both good and bad. They want leaders to find ways to have trade, but also to protect the voice of regular people, human rights, and the environment. For example, these people believe free trade agreements should include rules to make sure workers are treated well and the environment is protected. This group of people is sometimes called the social justice movement. Some people have marched in the streets to protest against globalization. The most famous protest in America was at the meeting of the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999. Protesters blocked leaders from getting from their hotels to the meetings. Protesters and Seattle police fought in the streets. During the battle in Seattle, over 600 people were arrested and thousands were hurt. Some protesters broke the windows of stores owned by large companies like Nike and many Starbucks that they thought were examples of the bad side of globalization. American leaders were surprised by the protests in Seattle. They didn't know people were so upset about globalization. People all over America were surprised to see video of the police using tear gas against peaceful protesters. For many, it reminded them of the fighting of the 1960s. Similar protests have been held in cities around the world: Washington, D.C., Genoa, Berlin, Paris, and Madrid. These protests have gotten a lot of attention, but they don't seem to have stopped or even slowed down globalization. One thing people who like globalization often point out is that trade restrictions, like tariffs, usually hurt poor people in third world countries. The WTO was started to help create free trade. So, these pro-globalists say, if the protesters really want to help the poor, they should be fighting for free trade and the WTO, not against it. Actually, most people in the third world countries like globalization. The people who have protested against it are mostly from rich countries. In the past few years, anti-globalization activists have found some politicians in Europe and the United States who will listen to what they have to say, mostly about free trade deals. In the United States, President Trump won in 2016, partly by saying that NAFTA was bad for America. When he was president, he signed the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which is a new version of NAFTA. Globalization has led to some good things in the United States. Because things can be made for less in other countries, Americans have to pay less when we go shopping. Televisions, clothing, cell phones, fruit, and many of the things for sale in America cost less because of globalization. Globalization has also made it possible for American businesses to make more money selling to people in other countries. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, McDonald's, Starbucks, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, Visa, Nike, Levi's, and many more have made money around the world. Even though there have been bad effects of globalization, many people in the developing world are now able to live a better life than they did before. People in the third world have found jobs working in factories, making the thing people in rich countries want to buy. And third world shoppers now are able to buy the same things Americans can buy. Overall, a smaller percentage of people in the world are poor. Let's finish by reviewing the big ideas from today's lesson. In the 1970s, high unemployment, low growth, and high inflation made life hard for many Americans. This situation was called stagflation. An oil embargo forced Americans to pay higher prices for gasoline and other goods. Imported cars that were fuel efficient became popular, and American car makers struggled. Globalization began in the 1970s. Globalization has hurt some Americans, especially in the Rust Belt of the Northeast and Midwest, where factories closed and workers lost their jobs. On the other hand, globalization has resulted in lower prices and a higher overall standard of living. There are a lot of economics in this lesson, which I know can be challenging sometimes, so thank you for sticking with me all the way through to the end. In fact, we've made it to the end of this unit, which means now it's time for a review. We learned about a variety of failures and mistakes Americans made, mostly in the 1960s and 70s. We talked about Vietnam, Watergate, the Iran hostage crisis, 3 Mile Island, and today we added the economy. It must have been an unsettling time to live through. Make sure you watch the review video. Use the Quizlet to review all these people, events, and ideas that we've been talking about. And use the study guide so you can keep all of it organized in your head so you can do an excellent job on your test. Good job, and I'll see you next time.